Well, 24 hours ago, Palestinians were celebrating the news that Hamas had accepted what they thought was Israel's ceasefire proposal. Now their situation looks bleak again after Israeli troops seized the Rafah border crossing, cutting off a vital aid route into Gaza. Yesterday, the Israel Defense Forces ordered people in eastern Rafah to move to what it called an expanded humanitarian zone in Mawasi, ahead of a limited ground invasion. After striking targets in eastern Rafah overnight, Israel announced its troops had taken control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, the only one it did not control. Israel has also imposed a naval blockade on Gaza for years. The UN says the shutting of the two southern crossings starves Gaza of the scant humanitarian aid it had been receiving, as very little is getting through the recently reopened Erez Crossing. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Porrick O'Brien, reports.
The Gaza side of the Rafah crossing into Egypt, a way in for aid, a way out for some trying to flee. Now deserted, apart from Israeli tanks and giant flags. The IDF say they are now in full operational control on this side of the crossing and that they had targeted, quote, terrorist infrastructure, including tunnels used by Hamas to bring in weaponry. For one tank driver, though, all infrastructure here seemed fair game. This just a day after yesterday's surprise announcement by Hamas said they'd accept a deal on a ceasefire and hostage release brokered by Egypt and Qatar. This afternoon, Benjamin Netanyahu described that as a ruse to wrong-foot Israel.
The entrance to Rafah serves two main war goals: the return of our hostages and the elimination of Hamas. We have already proven in the previous release of the abductees, military pressure on Hamas is a necessary condition for the return of our hostages. The Hamas proposal yesterday was intended to torpedo the entry of our forces into Rafah. It did not happen.
The Israelis say Hamas have not yet met several of their requirements around hostage release. The sticking points include issues around how many hostages are released, how often, and in what order the bodies of dead hostages should be handed over. Another hurdle: would Israel be able to veto the release of Palestinian prisoners who've committed more serious crimes? Yesterday, the Israelis warned people to leave Rafah and head to places like Mawasi on the coast. From there, they watched Rafah being targeted again and again. Last night, at least 20 people were killed in strikes on the city, including members of this man's family.
My wife, my two brothers, my sister and niece were martyred. That's what happened to us. We did nothing. We were sleeping peacefully. We're not wanted people. We're not Hamas. I'm a labourer working in construction.
Israel said it had killed 20 Hamas fighters and destroyed a number of tunnels overnight. International leaders, including Joe Biden, have scrambled to dissuade Benjamin Netanyahu from ordering a full-scale invasion of Rafah without a plan to protect civilians. The Israelis described the latest offensive there as a limited operation. On one side of the Rafah crossing, then the tanks. On the other, mile after mile of now completely stationary aid and a UN appeal to open the gates.
Rafah is the epicenter of humanitarian operations in Gaza. Attacking Rafah will further upend our efforts to support people in dire humanitarian straits as famine looms.
The questions now: how limited will the Rafah offensive turn out to be? Will ceasefire talks become lasting truce? And if you're one of Rafah's 1.4 million displaced, how many more times will I have to move?
Well, here in Hostage Square, they gather to think of those still held by Hamas. But just a few minutes away, there is a much angrier protest going on where the families of some hostages are joining other Israelis to call for Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept the deal and quit. I went to speak to some of them earlier.
This is my son, Nimrod. 19 years old, going to 20, was kidnapped on the morning of the 7th of October.
And you want Netanyahu to take the deal?
We want Netanyahu to take the deal. We want Netanyahu to take any deal. We want Netanyahu to declare ceasefire in return of all the hostages.
Why do you think they've stopped it?
They didn't even begin it. Our government, our horrible government, doesn't want to go for a deal. They want to show a picture of victory. There's no victory.
Every day that passes, another hostage is dead, actually. That is the actual truth.
So do the deal.
We need a deal, and we do it, and we didn't need it now. And yesterday, Hamas accepted the deal that's on the table. We need to go there and negotiate for the better deal we can and get all the hostages back. It's urgent.
Do you agree with them?
Yes.
You do?
Yes, better.
Yes and no.
Why did you say yes and no?
Yes and no. They need to bring back the hostage. Of course, there are blood, there are our people, but this is not the way. I think this is not the way.
Nobody from government doesn't care.
Do you think they should take the deal?
Bibi don't want deal, Bibi don't want anything.
Well, I'm joined now by Daniel Livitz. Daniel had two grandparents taken hostage by Hamas on October the 7th. His grandmother was released last year, but his grandfather, Oded, who is in his 80s, is still being held. Thank you for joining us. When you heard of this deal, and Hamas said they had accepted it, what did you think? Did you think Israel should be taking it too?
First of all, I think it's a major step, and I think that Israel has to send a negotiation team, including the head of the Mossad, head of Shabak, and Nitzan Alon, to negotiate and come to the agreement. And
so beef up the negotiating team from what it is now?
Exactly. They need the top negotiation team with the mandate to close a deal.
I mean, do you feel that they are really doing everything to bring the hostages home now, or are they trying to buy themselves some time to go into Rafah, which is what they've done?
Well, you know, in the Middle East, what I read today is that negotiations are always under fire. What I'm calling, yes, of course, hold the fire, don't make any more people hurt, and for sure, concentrate on making the deal come true. If I can say that they made everything, we are after 250 days. Of course, I can't say that they do everything to bring the hostages back home, but now there is a real chance to do it. I really feel that it's the last opportunity to bring everyone's back.
Why do you say that?
Because I feel that as much as the time passes, of course, from the humanitarian part, we will have already less and less people every day. Of course, as well, I expect Hamas to release my grandfather unconditionally, long time ago, as they released my grandmother. You know, my grandfather, who should never been kidnapped. I can't imagine even now that he is held hostage in Gaza. He is the only great-grandfather held hostage in the world, which is 84 years old in the May 11th, in few days, and he should be released unconditionally with all the hostages, but for sure with all the humanitarian deal that is going to pass in the first stage. So I do believe that now is the last chance to make a deal that brings everyone's home and the suffer of the Gazans, like my grandfather always wanted, that Hamas will never be there.
So when you say they should hold their fire, you want a ceasefire now, do you? Or do you think the offensive that is going on now in Rafah should carry on?
I think that now each part, as Hamas bombed Kerem Shalom a few days ago, for me it showed like, okay, maybe they are doing it and they will say yes soon. I hope that it's the same for the Israeli part.
Each side is
military pressure. Exactly. But yes, of course, I'm calling everyone to stop the fight because
people are being killed, aren't they? You know,
people are being killed, and of course, it's much easier to make good negotiations when everyone are under a table without fire.
And when you see the details around this negotiation, you know that it's about Is it 3 hostages every 3 days or 3 hostages every week? And that these are the kinds of things that are stopping the release of people like your grandfather. How does that make you feel?
First of all, it makes me feel horrible that if there will be a deal on those terms, it will be a release of 3 hostages every week. But from the other side, it's starting to release the hostages. If that will be the deal, we'll accept it and have 3 hostages every week, 3 people, 3 souls back to us every day, and there will be no more fighting for this part for sure, which is very important for me personally.
And do you feel it's a sincere negotiation?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, from what I heard, Bill Barnes ended the negotiations in Cairo and immediately went to Doha to close the terms together with to push Hamas with the Qatari Prime Minister, and they got to some kind of a deal. I know that it's a little bit blur for the moment, but that's why the negotiations team now have the work and have the opportunity to close the deal. So that is a possibility, and the negotiations are running. I heard Kirby announcement today saying that the gaps are closed and the deal is possible, and as well that the Israeli knows the terms and knew what's going on in the negotiations.
Daniel Livitz, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Ola Saeed works at the Shuhada Al-Aqsa Hospital in Rafah, and she joins me now from southern Gaza. Thank you for joining us, Doctor. Can you tell me what the situation is where you are?
I am a doctor, general practitioner doctor from Gaza. I worked as a volunteer doctor in emergency department. Previously, I worked in Al-Shifa Hospital, but after displacement from Gaza to Nasser Complex, and then Najjar Hospital, and currently in Shuhada Al-Aqsa Hospital.
And tell me, what is the sort of the mood of the people there at the moment, as they have been told to evacuate from one part of Rafah into a supposedly safe area? Do people trust that?
I can't understand what you are saying.
I'm saying, what is the mood of the people at the moment? I'm saying, how do people feel where you are about being told to evacuate?
We are very afraid from evacuation, and from evacuate from site to another site from the beginning of the war till this moment. We cannot feel with the yeah.
And do you think that people believe there will be a deal? Do you believe there will be a deal?
We are dealing with an explosive injury cases that come to emergency department. The cases that come from the simple case to the case that need surgery. There is many cases comes in the ER department.
Doctor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Obviously, it's a very difficult line, and it's very difficult speaking to someone who doesn't speak Arabic. I apologise for my lack of language skills. Yes. Thank you for joining us. Now, for weeks, President Biden and his administrations have been urging the Israelis not to launch a full-scale offensive against Rafah. It was a message reiterated by the president in a half-hour phone call to Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday. So how has Washington reacted to the bombardment? Over to our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy.
Well, Krishnan, in the last hour or so, I've been listening into the White House press briefing with John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman. 3 things I would say of note. Firstly, on Rafah, as you say, the White House has been at great pains to say it would not support any major incursion into Rafah that puts at risk the lives of the Palestinians who are sheltering there. And John Kirby today firmly firmly reiterated that position. But then he said that Israel overnight had assured the US that this operation last night was, he said, limited in scope and scale and duration, and it was just about cutting off Hamas's ability to be able to smuggle arms across the border into Gaza. Therefore, the White House believes this operation is not of a scale and size that would equate to a major operation, but he noted that it has just started and said that the US would be watching very closely, he said, and monitoring what goes on the ground. Secondly, he said the US was pressing very hard to get those access points, those gates open again into Rafah. On that, he said that Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday in his call with Joe Biden had promised that very soon, he said, that the gate Karem Shalom that had been attacked by those rockets over the weekend, that he assured that that would be open very soon, and that US officials were pressing hard for the Rafah gate to be open soon. Didn't say what soon means. Thirdly, on the ceasefire talks, John Kirby said that they were ongoing now in Cairo, that everybody was sitting around the table, and that, he said, was hugely significant, and that everything points to the US believes, and I quote, that they should be able very soon to close the remaining gaps. So he did not say, of course, what those remaining gaps were or when they would be closed. All of this against a backdrop of Joe Biden giving a very big, very powerful speech, I have to say, today on Holocaust Remembrance Day, in which, of course, he didn't comment at all about the events in Rafah overnight, but did launch a staunch defense of America's close relationship with Israel. Let's hear from President Biden now.
Just 7.5 months later, and people are already forgetting that Hamas unleashed this terror. I have not forgotten, nor have you, and we will not forget. To the Jewish community, I want you to know, I see your fear, your hurt, and your pain. Let me reassure you, as your president, you're not alone. You belong. You always have and you always will. And my commitment to the safety of the Jewish people, the security of Israel, and its right to exist as an independent Jewish state is ironclad, even when we disagree.
Well, when we disagree, Joe Biden said very pointedly there, we know that he does disagree very much with this incursion into Rafah, but today was not the day to talk about that. There are reports, though, that for the first time since October the 7th, the US is holding back on the delivery of 2 types of Boeing-made precision bombs. John Kirby was asked about that in the White House press briefing. Again, he said that he would not comment. He said, we do not talk about individual shipments one way or the other, but there is a sense that Joe Biden is saying something publicly, but perhaps beginning to put pressure on behind the scenes.
Siobhan Kennedy in Washington. Well, Alan Pinkas is a former Israeli diplomat who has been chief of staff or foreign policy advisor to one Israeli prime minister and 4 foreign ministers. Thanks for joining us. Can you talk me through what you think Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy is right now? What's he doing and why?
I don't think, Christian, that he has a strategy. I think it's a accumulation of tactical moves, all subject to one sole purpose, and that is his political survival. He has not assumed responsibility for the debacle of October 7th. He has not been held accountable. He refuses to be held accountable. He has not set forth a plan for post-war Gaza. He has not defined clearly the war's aims, and he has been stalling on the hostages issue because it is accompanied inevitably by a ceasefire on the grounds, or using the argument that an invasion of Rafah is necessary and imperative to topple Hamas, which I think 9 out of 10 Israelis do not take seriously. There's no question that ever since 6:30 in the morning of October 7th, 2023, by the way, 7 full months ago today, he has done nothing but try and extricate himself from this political problem that he found himself in.
Right, so can you explain how we got into a situation where Hamas thought they were agreeing to an Israeli deal and then Israel backed away from it? You know, was it ever agreed by Israel? Or, you know, was Netanyahu taken by surprise when they said yes?
I think he was. Okay, there are two ways of looking at this, Christian. One is, you know, the micro perspective, the micro angle, and that is, to which agreement did Hamas say yes, and to which agreement did Israel say not really? And that has to do with two different drafts. One that Israel apparently consented to, at least in principle, from the 27th of April, 10 days ago. And the second draft, the one which Hamas yesterday announced that it accepts, is apparently a somewhat tweaked draft that was conducted by the Qataris, the Egyptians, and indirectly by the Americans. As you know, Christian, the director of the CIA is here in the region overlooking these efforts. So I think the confusion on why Israel says no to a deal that everyone says, well, you said yes to this already, it's not exactly the same deal, which of course, beckons the question of, does Israel really want a deal? And it's a complicated answer. But then there is a bigger perspective, a macro perspective. And that pertains, Christian, to the issue of the end of the war. Hamas is insistent on a prolonged ceasefire, which the Americans have more than once said would signify or constitute the de facto end of the war. If the war ends, then Israel cannot claim it won. In fact, Hamas, by virtue of the asymmetry between the two, standing on their feet and waving one flag, Hamas can claim some kind of a victory, even though they have been significantly degraded militarily and politically. And so the issue of does this deal, how does this deal affect the concept of the end of the war, is also a major difference between the two sides.
Alan Pinkas, thank you very much indeed.